The glow of birthday candles flickered against the polished wood of the diner booth, casting soft halos on plates of half-eaten apple pie. Laughter rose around me, warm and familiar, yet somewhere deep inside a strange unease pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, a 66th birthday marked by comfort food, family chatter, and the clink of silverware. But ordinary nights can split open in an instant, revealing shadows you never expected at your own table. Before I take you into that night, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have felt if a celebration suddenly turned into something terrifying? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from? Your. Words mean more than you know. And if stories of resilience and shocking truth speak to you, please subscribe and join me here. There are more chapters to share, and I'd love for you to walk this path with me. My name is Margaret Turner. I'm 66 years old, a widow, and I spent most of my life as a nurse in Austin, Texas. Caring for others was what I knew best, patients, neighbors, even strangers who needed someone steady in the chaos. But that night, as I sat across from my daughter Susan and her husband David in a cozy old-style diner I'd adored since the 1970s, I realized how blind care can make you. The place was alive with small-town energy, birthday balloons tied to chairs, jukebox, humming an old Patsy Cline tune, waitresses balancing trays stacked with burgers and milkshakes. To anyone walking past, we looked like a family wrapped in joy. David had even raised a glass of red wine and said, "Here's to Mom for everything she's given us." His words made me smile, and for a heartbeat, I forgot the loneliness that had often followed me home since my husband died. Then in a moment so quick it felt like sleight of hand, a young waitress with tired eyes and a firm set to her job brushed past my elbow. Something cool and folded pressed into my palm. I blinked down. It was a slip of paper creased, written in hurried, almost trembling script, "Don't drink your wine." My chest tightened. The room blurred, the laughter around me muffled as if I were underwater. I slid the note beneath the napkin, my fingers shaking. Susan's bright smile across the table looked suddenly different, tight, watchful, as if she were waiting for something. David chatted casually, oblivious. Every instinct I had as a nurse told me the note wasn't a joke. I forced my lips into a smile, steadying my hands. Then, while David turned to call for more bread, I made a single choice that felt like walking a tightrope between sanity and madness. I lifted my glass, swapped it with his in one practiced movement, and whispered a silent prayer that no one had noticed. In that instant, the warmth of the birthday faded into the cold edge of survival. And though I didn't yet know it, that choice would reveal a truth more horrifying than any disease I had ever witnessed in a hospital ward. The glass felt heavier in my hand after I set it down, as if the liquid itself carried the weight of a secret no one else could see. My heart hammered against my ribs, but outwardly I kept my smile thin, strained a mask I'd worn many times in the hospital when patients needed calm, not panic. David lifted his glass, now mine, and tipped it back with an easy laugh. The sound chilled me more than comforted. 5 minutes is both nothing and an eternity. Conversation floated around me in fragments, Susan chatting about a home renovation, the scrape of forks against plates, the birthday balloons swaying gently in the air conditioning. My eyes never left David. He chuckled at something, but then the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. At first it was subtle, a tremor in his hand as he set the glass down, the crease in his forehead as though fighting a sudden wave of nausea. Then came the sweat beading along his temple, sliding down his cheek in a way that no warm diner should explain. "David, are you all right?" Susan's voice sharpened with alarm. He tried to answer, but his lips moved without sound. His body swayed, and before I could push back my chair, he collapsed forward, his weight rattling the table, spilling wine across the white paper tablecloth. The room froze for a heartbeat, then shattered into chaos, shouts clattering dishes, chairs scraping the linoleum. I didn't move. My hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles blanched. I had seen countless emergencies in my years as a nurse, but this was different. This wasn't a stranger in an ER. This was family, and every second his body convulsed, my mind repeated the same truth that was meant for me. A waitress screamed for someone to call 911. Another ran for a first aid kit. Susan knelt by her husband, shaking him, pleading with him to wake up. And me, his mother-in-law, sat rooted in place, clutching the folded note in my pocket like a talisman. I forced myself to kneel beside them, my training taking over. His pulse was erratic, shallow, his breathing ragged. "Stay with us, David," I whispered, my voice steadier than I felt. My daughter's tear-streaked face looked up at me, desperate. "Mom, what's happening to him?" What could I say? That her husband was paying the price for a drink that had been intended for me, that her smile, that entire performance tonight was already tainted by suspicion, clawing at the edges of my heart. I couldn't. Not yet. The wail of sirens cut through the diner's thick panic, growing louder, until the red and blue lights painted the windows. Paramedics burst in, practiced efficiency clearing space. They lifted David onto a stretcher wires and monitors, attaching to him like lifelines. Susan clung to his hand, sobbing as they wheeled him out. I followed slower, my legs trembling. Outside, the Texas night air was humid, heavy with the scent of asphalt and fried food from the diner kitchen. Neighbors and strangers alike had gathered in clusters, whispering. I caught fragments. Heart attack, poison. Look at her face. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Susan climbed inside without hesitation, her hand still gripping her husband's arm. One of the paramedics turned to me. "Ma'am, you coming?" I hesitated. For a fraction of a second, I saw myself through their eyes, an old woman birthday sash, slightly crooked eyes wide with something that wasn't just fear, something more knowledge. I shook myself free and climbed in. The sirens roared and the city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow. Inside, the antiseptic smell of emergency gear mingled with David's shallow gasps. I sat across from Susan, the folded note burning like fire in my pocket. The truth had not yet been spoken aloud, but I already knew it with bone-deep certainty. The glass, the warning, the collapse, it all aligned into one horrifying conclusion. It wasn't random. It wasn't fate. Someone had wanted me dead, and they had been sitting at that table with me all along. The ambulance screamed through the night, every red flash against the window a reminder that the line between life and death could be thinner than a sip of wine. At the hospital, doors swung open, voices barked orders, and David disappeared behind curtains swallowed by machines and fluorescent light. Susan clung to me, trembling, her nails digging crescents into my arm. "Mom, he was fine this morning," she whispered. "What's happening to him?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The note still burned in my pocket, silent proof that what we were witnessing wasn't chance. Hours blurred together in the waiting room, that cruel place where plastic chairs and stale coffee become the stage for fear. The air reeked of disinfectant, the clock's hands moved with cruel slowness, and every time the double doors swung open, I braced myself. Finally, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his face wearing that practiced mask of concern. "Mrs. Turner, Ms. Turner." His voice was calm, but his eyes told the truth before his words did. "We ran a full panel on David. His blood work shows extremely high levels of digoxin." Susan blinked. "Digoxin? What's that?" The doctor sighed. "It's a medication for heart conditions. In safe doses, it regulates rhythm. But the concentration in his system, it's far beyond therapeutic. Frankly, it's poisonous." Poisonous? The word clanged in my head like a bell tolling at a funeral. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Are you saying someone tried to poison him?" "I can't determine intent," the doctor replied, measured and careful. "But this amount couldn't have been accidental. It had to be ingested." Susan's knees buckled. She dropped into the chair beside me. "Oh my God, David! Who would want to hurt David?" Her eyes were wide wet, searching mine as if I held the answer. And I did. Because it wasn't David who had been the target. It was me. The world seemed to tilt, spinning me back through the fog of the last few months. The unexplained fatigue that crept into my bones. The dizzy spells I'd chalked up to aging. The moments of forgetfulness that Susan was always quick to point out. "Mom, you already told me that story yesterday. Mom, you left the stove on again." Each time she'd looked at me with pitying concern, each time I doubted myself more. But nurses know their bodies. And now, staring at the sterile floor tiles beneath my feet, I realized the truth that had been lurking in the shadows all along. Those weren't signs of age. They were symptoms. Symptoms of something being slipped into my tea, my coffee, the drinks Susan so often insisted on making for me. My chest tightened. I glanced at her beside me, crumpled in the waiting room chair, crying over her husband. She looked so convincing, so broken, so human. But I knew better now. The mask of grief she wore had cracks, and through them I saw the glint of calculation. The doctor excused himself, promising updates. Silence fell heavy between us. Susan reached for my hand. "Mom, this can't be real. Who would ever do this?" Her fingers were warm, trembling against mine. I forced myself not to recoil, though every instinct screamed at me to pull away. Instead, I squeezed her hand gently, my smile thin, controlled. "Yes," I said softly. Who indeed, inside the truth carved itself into me with icy certainty. My daughter hadn't just been preparing me for a nursing home. She had been preparing me for the grave. And the thought that broke me wasn't just that she wanted me gone. It was how close she had come to making me believe I deserved it. The words she had been preparing me for the grave echoed long after the doctor left us in that sterile waiting room. Susan sat slumped beside me, shoulders shaking, her tears dampening the sleeve of her cardigan. Anyone watching would see a distraught wife terrified for her husband's life. But I saw something else, the faintest curve at the corner of her lips. When she thought I wasn't looking, a glimmer that vanished as quickly as it came. And suddenly pieces I had ignored began sliding back into place. For months she had been whispering doubts into my ear like poison disguised as concern. "Mom, you already told me that yesterday." "Mom, you forgot to pay that bill again. Maybe it's time we looked into someplace safe, a good facility with nurses who understand dementia." At first, I laughed it off. Then I doubted myself. Was 66 too young for memory lapses? I found myself writing notes on sticky pads, leaving reminders on the fridge, triple-checking the locks at night. Each time I slipped, Susan was right there, nodding sympathetically, fueling the quiet terror that my mind was unraveling. Now I saw it for what it was: rehearsal. A script designed to make everyone believe that when the end came for me, it would be natural, inevitable. I remembered another moment, one that stung sharper now. Just 3 weeks earlier, David had sat with me on my porch swing, hands folded, tone gentle but firm. "Mom, Susan's right. Maybe it would help to sign a power of attorney. Nothing drastic, just so she can take care of bills if anything happens. It would give us all peace of mind." I'd looked at his earnest face, the young man I once trusted like a son, and nearly agreed. My pen had hovered over the dotted line. But something inside me had resisted. Maybe it was pride, maybe instinct. Either way, I set the pen down, claiming I needed more time. Now I knew that hesitation might have saved my life. But the final blow came not from the hospital, not from the waiting room, but from across my own front yard. George Miller, my neighbor of 20 years, a retired postman with a stooped back and a memory like a steel trap, stopped me one morning a few days after the collapse. I was on my way to fetch the paper when he called out, "Margaret, can I have a word?" His eyes were troubled. "I've been meaning to ask, what's Susan been bringing over every Tuesday? Always those little brown bottles saying they're vitamins for you." My stomach dropped. "Bottles?" "Yeah," he nodded slowly. "She told me they were supplements to help with your memory. Said you'd been struggling. I figured it was none of my business, but I've been worried. You've looked pale lately, tired. Not yourself." For a moment, the world tilted again. I thought of the bitter aftertaste in the tea she made, the way coffee sometimes left me dizzy, the unexplained nausea I blamed on age. And I realized George had seen the truth long before I had. She called them vitamins. I whispered more to myself than to him. George placed a hand on my arm. "Margaret, I've known you since your kids were in grade school. You're sharp as a tack. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His voice was firm, protective. "If something's not right, you need to trust yourself." His words were like a match struck in the dark, illuminating what I had been too scared to face. Susan wasn't just preparing the world to doubt me. She had been quietly, systematically dismantling me, sip by sip, pill by pill, while smiling sweetly and calling me Mom. And now, with George's confirmation, the gnawing suspicion hardened into certainty. My own daughter had been slowly poisoning me. George's words left me shaken but also strangely steadier, as if someone had finally said aloud what my heart had been whispering for weeks. Yet even with his warning, I still clung to a sliver of doubt. How could my own daughter orchestrate something so monstrous mothers don't want to believe the worst of their children? That doubt vanished the night Emily Carter came back into my life. I had seen her only once before, just long enough for her hand to slip me the note that saved me at my birthday dinner. After David's collapse, she disappeared into the chaos, another nameless waitress swallowed by flashing sirens and police tape. But 2 days later, as I walked out of the hospital cafeteria with a paper cup of coffee, a soft voice called from behind me, "Mrs. Turner." I turned to find her standing there, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, eyes too old for her young face. She wore plain scrubs, her name badge crooked. Emily Carter, student nurse. My pulse jumped. "I'm sorry if this is forward," she said quickly, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "But I need to explain why I warned you that night. We found an empty bench near the side entrance. The air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust, and I braced myself as she drew in a shaky breath. My grandmother," she began, "died 2 years ago. She was healthy, 78, still gardening, still cooking Sunday dinners. Then she started getting confused, tired, forgetful. The family thought it was dementia." Emily's voice caught. She was admitted to Green Pines Assisted Living. Within 6 months, she was gone. Official cause: heart failure. Tears pricked my eyes, not just for her loss, but because the story sounded like an echo of my own. "What does that have to do with Susan?" I asked, though the answer was already rising in my gut. Emily's gaze hardened. "Back then, before she married your daughter, Susan worked at Green Pines under her maiden name, Susan Miller. She was my grandmother's CNA. She visited constantly, always with food or drinks she said would help." Emily's voice dropped. "My grandmother used to whisper to me, 'She makes me take vitamins. They taste bitter.'" I thought she was just confused, but after she died, I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. A chill ripped down my spine. "And you think—" I couldn't finish. Emily nodded grimly. "I think she killed her, and when I saw her with you at the diner, I knew she hadn't stopped." The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. It was one thing to suspect manipulation, to piece together odd symptoms and whispered suggestions. It was another to hear from a stranger that my daughter had left a trail of death before me. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "I tried," Emily whispered, her eyes filling. "But I was just a 19-year-old grieving granddaughter. No evidence. No one believed me. They said elderly people die of heart problems all the time. So I promised myself if I ever saw her again, I wouldn't stay quiet." She leaned closer. "That night when she poured your wine, I saw her slip something in. It was quick practiced. I couldn't prove it, but I couldn't let you drink it." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of her words pressed into me, the confirmation I hadn't wanted, but now couldn't deny. My daughter hadn't just betrayed me, she had perfected her method on others. Emily's hand trembled as she touched mine. "You're not crazy, Mrs. Turner. She's dangerous. And now you know." I closed my eyes, the hum of the hospital fading around me. When I opened them, the fear inside me had changed shape. It was no longer just dread, it was resolve. Because if Emily was right, Susan hadn't simply tried to poison me. She had done it before, and she would do it again, unless someone stopped her. Emily's words followed me home like a shadow I couldn't shake. For the first time, I allowed myself to say it aloud in the quiet of my bedroom. "My daughter is trying to kill me." The words sounded foreign, impossible, and yet every piece of evidence whispered the same truth. It didn't take long before the police became involved. David's toxicology report forced the hospital to call them in, and soon, detectives began asking questions. One in particular stood out, a woman in her early 50s with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to cut through pretense. She introduced herself as Detective Linda Harris. She pulled a chair close during our first interview, her tone steady but laced with something personal, as though she carried her own ghosts. "Mrs. Turner, I want you to understand I've seen cases like this before. Too many, but this time I don't intend to let it slip through the cracks." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "You think she's done this before?" I whispered. Detective Harris nodded. "Your daughter's work history is troubling. Before she married, she was employed at several assisted living facilities. We've already found 3 cases where elderly residents died suddenly, each death attributed to heart failure, all under her watch." The room spun. My thoughts flashed to Emily's grandmother, to the whispered suspicions no one believed. But Harris wasn't finished. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were pages of search histories and receipts recovered from Susan's laptop and credit cards. Terms leapt off the paper like knives: how to dissolve digoxin in wine, altering legal documents, power of attorney, causes of dementia in seniors. I felt my breath catch. "She was laying the groundwork," I said softly, "convincing everyone I was losing my mind." "Yes," Harris agreed, "and it didn't stop there. We've uncovered drafts of forged documents, altered versions of your will giving Susan sole control of your assets. She's been planning this for months, maybe years." My stomach turned as the betrayal deepened. Money, control. My life reduced to a strategy, a set of calculated steps. Detective Harris leaned forward, her voice low. "I need to tell you something else. A few years ago, I investigated a similar case, an elderly man who died suddenly after showing signs of confusion and weakness. I suspected poisoning, but there wasn't enough evidence. The woman caring for him vanished. Now I realize that woman was your daughter under her maiden name. It's haunted me ever since." This time her jaw tightened. "I will not let her walk away." Hearing that should have brought me relief. Instead, grief flooded me heavier than any fear. My child, the girl I had rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bike, watched walk down the aisle. She wasn't just trying to take my life. She might have taken others long before me. Detective Harris must have seen the tears gathering in my eyes. Her voice softened. "Mrs. Turner, I know this is unbearable, but your strength is the key here. You noticed the signs. You trusted your instincts. That note, that switch of glasses, it saved your life. And now with your testimony and what we've found, we can build a case strong enough to finally stop her." I nodded, though my hands trembled. For the first time, my fear began to transform not into peace, but into something harder, sharper. Resolve. Susan's web of lies was unraveling thread by thread, and as much as it tore me apart, I knew I had to keep pulling until the entire fabric of her deceit lay exposed. Because the truth wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about every voice silenced before me and making sure no one else ever suffered at my daughter's hands again. Detective Harris warned me before we walked into the hospital room. "She'll try to manipulate you, Mrs. Turner. That's what people like her do, turn weakness into performance. Don't let her pull you back in." I nodded, though my knees felt unsteady. Every step down that antiseptic hallway was like walking into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too cruel. When Harris pushed open the door, the air felt colder, somehow heavy with something unspoken. Susan lay propped against white pillows, bon lines trailing from her arm. Her hair was mussed, her face pale, but her eyes were alert, calculating beneath the facade of frailty. As soon as she saw me, her mouth trembled into what looked like relief. "Mom," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "Thank God you're here. I was so scared. I thought I lost you." For a moment, something inside me cracked. The mother in me wanted to rush forward to take her hand to believe her. But then I remembered the bitter taste in my tea, the papers she tried to trick me into signing Emily's grandmother, the forged documents. My heart hardened. "You nearly did," I said, quietly. Her face faltered just for an instant, then she blinked rapidly, summoning tears. No, you've misunderstood. Someone tried to poison both of us. I would never..." Detective Harris stepped forward, dropping a folder onto the rolling tray. Pages spilled out, search histories, bank records, the receipts for bottles of digoxin. "Stop the act, Susan. We have everything we need." I saw it then. The shift, the mask slipped. Her tears dried almost instantly, replaced by a cold, steady stare. She glanced at me, then back at Harris, her lips curling into something that was neither smile nor sneer. "So what if I did?" she said at last, her voice low, stripped of pretense. What was I supposed to do? Watch her waste away, clinging to money she doesn't even use? I was planning for the future, our future. Mine, David's. Even yours, in a way. My stomach twisted. In what world is poisoning me, planning for my future? She tilted her head, almost amused. "Don't be so dramatic, Mom. I wasn't killing you, not right away, just easing you into inevitability. A nursing home. Comfort. Peace. You'd barely know it was happening." Detective Harris's jaw clenched. "You call that comfort?" Susan's eyes flickered hard and unrepentant. "I call it mercy. Do you know how many old people I've helped go peacefully, patients who were suffering, families who didn't want to deal with them anymore? I was the only one willing to do what needed to be done." Her words sliced through me. Not only had she tried to murder me, my own child, but she spoke of it as though it were kindness. "Helped." My voice cracked. "You mean you killed them?" She didn't flinch. "They were going to die anyway. I just sped things up. And yes, maybe I made sure their families weren't left struggling. That's not evil, it's practical." In that moment, I felt my heart break and harden all at once. The little girl who once clutched my hand on the first day of school, who cried when she skinned her knee, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone who looked at me and saw not a mother, but an obstacle. I swayed on my feet, and suddenly George's steady hand was on my shoulder. Emily stood on my other side, her eyes blazing with anger, but also with compassion. Their presence anchored me. I looked at Susan one last time. "You didn't just betray me," I whispered. "You betrayed everything I ever gave you, love, trust, my whole life. And you threw it away for money." For the first time, her expression flickered, not guilt, but irritation, as though my words were an inconvenience. Detective Harris gathered the files. "That's enough. We're done here." As we walked out of the room, I felt the weight of finality. The daughter I loved was gone, swallowed by her own greed and darkness. What remained was a stranger. And I knew then the only family I could trust were the ones who had chosen to stand beside me, not by blood, but by loyalty and truth. When the door shut behind me that day in the hospital, it felt as if a chapter of my life had slammed closed with it. Susan's voice, flat and unapologetic, echoed in my mind for weeks afterward. My daughter, the one I once thought would hold my hand in my final years, was gone not by death, but by the choices she had made. What remained was a stranger, condemned by her own cruelty. The trial came quickly. Detective Harris presented evidence with the precision of someone who had waited years for justice. Emily testified with trembling but unshakable resolve, telling the jury about her grandmother's last months and how she'd watched Susan's patterns repeat. George spoke of the bottles delivered weekly, his voice steady and unafraid, and I told my story, every painful detail from the first bitter sip of coffee to the night I switched the glasses. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Susan was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the gavel fell, I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. I had saved my life, but I had lost my daughter forever. In the months that followed, I moved away from the house that had become a prison of its own, filled with shadows of what Susan had done. I found a small cottage near Lake Travis, its porch facing the water where the sunrise spilled gold across the ripples. I adopted a rescue dog, a gentle golden retriever named Daisy, whose quiet companionship filled the silences that once made me ache. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. I brewed my own coffee. I trusted the food on my table. And with every ordinary act, I stitched myself back together. Emily visited often, her nursing degree nearly finished. She brought her textbooks, stories of patients, and sometimes just laughter to brighten the quiet cottage. She started calling me her honorary grandma, and I let her. It healed something raw in me to feel chosen not out of obligation but affection. George. My steady neighbor made the drive from our old street once a week. He patched my porch steps, planted tomatoes in my garden, and reminded me that trust once shattered could grow again if you tended to it like a seed. On the morning of my 67th birthday, Daisy curled at my feet, George stood at the counter brewing coffee, and Emily bustled in with a homemade cake chocolate with too much frosting. She laughed as she set it down, the candles glowing bright in the dim kitchen. I looked at them, this unlikely family that had risen from the ashes of betrayal, and felt something I hadn't in so long: peace. The candles flickered their tiny flames, a reminder of the night one nearly extinguished me. But now they weren't symbols of fear. They were proof of survival, of strength I hadn't known I carried until I was forced to. As I leaned forward to blow them out, I didn't wish for safety. I already had that. I didn't wish for forgiveness. That was beyond me. I wished for one thing only: to keep living fully, fiercely, without ever again letting someone convince me I was weak. The flames vanished in a single breath. And for the first time in a long, long time, I smiled, not with the brittle mask I'd worn through suspicion and fear, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had walked through hell and found her way back. My story was no longer one of victimhood. It was a story of survival, of resilience, of rebirth. And that night, as I sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight, Daisy's head warm against my hand, I knew one thing for certain: I was not afraid anymore.